Do you have any experience before and after, like being in your religion, previous religion, about the bias between how sex shaming is done on boys versus girls, both growing up and also later as adults?
Are you asking, have I learned much about like the differences of the lasting ramifications on?
No, for example, I noticed that even as atheists, right? I think the effect of sex shaming is still we carry that with us after we leave our religion, but in interesting ways. In that, even as people who are claim to be sex positive, there seems to be more tolerance towards, for example, men experimenting and being with multiple partners, and doing, for example, even like if you ask, for example, fathers, right, who are not even religious anymore, if they would be comfortable with their son having many sex partners. I think a lot of some fathers would be like, yeah, that would be even proud of their son for being able to. I mean, the word that is used is usually a player, right? Player is usually considered to be a positive word, right? Somebody that has managed to achieve something. But again, as a non-religious atheist father, if you ask them the same thing about their daughter, they would all of a sudden feel very uncomfortable about having a daughter that has experiments a lot and has many sexual partners and just is known for going around and being very easy, the word that they use, or like the other word that people often think of when they think of a woman that has many sexual partners is the word slut, which is, unlike the word player, seems to be used more often as a as a negative. But so I don't know if we could associate this bias with religion's upbringing, or is it culture, or is it culture being influenced by religion? I don't know what are your thoughts on that. And have you noticed that also as when you were religious, and then later, like how was it different? Yeah. So what do you expect?
Yeah, I think I understand. I think what I hear you saying is addressing the sexual double standards that still exist even in the secular world, even with people who are not even formally religious. I guess my two thoughts came to mind as I was listening to your question. I do think that even secular society is still very deeply shaped by our more recent religions in the past like 10,000 years. I still think that a lot of the remnants of what we might call purity culture still bleed over into a secular society. And I think that comes from just even if someone's not raised religious their whole life, say they're born into an atheist household, but they grow up in America or Canada, someplace very, very Western, I still think that because Canada and America were founded by people who did tend to believe in Christianity, I think it's so deeply rooted in our culture that it's become a little bit difficult to distinguish religion and culture in that sense and other senses. The second thing that I would say to that, as to why maybe a parent might be more concerned about their daughter having more sexual partners than a boy, is I do think that there is something, I would argue that there's a biological reason for that too, that's maybe not conscious, but I think that females we have higher stakes. The consequences are higher for us having more sexual partners because there's pregnancy, number one. And I think even if this is not necessarily conscious and a parent's either approval or disapproval of how many sexual partners their child has, I do think that on a base level, we just know that it's going to cost a girl physically, financially, educationally. We know it's going to cost her more. The risk of sex is higher, I think, for women because there's the risk of pregnancy. And I would say that would be the more religion stripped thought that I have about that. That and yeah, I think like what you suggested, the intermingling of how religion does shape cultures. It's difficult for me to imagine a culture without religion. Yeah, does that answer? Partially?
Yes, very much.
I think for myself, like I definitely still see with people that I've talked to who also grew up very religiously, whether it was Mormonism or even Scientology, which most religions have some sort of opinion about sex. It's interesting for me always to talk to the men who have left and understand better how purity cultures affected them, because there's lots of literature on how purity cultures affected women, especially, at least what I've personally come across, especially in ex-Christian and ex-Muslim circles. But there's not as much data as to how it's affected men. I think a lot of the symptoms for women are more obvious, like vaginismus, for instance, when sex is extremely painful because you've spent so many years dissociating yourself that even when you do get married and try to have sex, you physically can't, or it's just extremely painful and difficult. I think that there's just a lot more objective and quantifiable data for women and how it's affected them than there is men that I've found, but we all know it's there. Guy friends of mine who were raised very religiously, who are not anymore, I've asked them in private conversations, and for them, the common theme that I hear the most is just overwhelming shame. Even though they're so split from that belief system now, they still struggle with so much shame for their sexual attraction or their desires or their fantasy or their porn life, whatever it is. Even shame for how they react to slutty women now, even though they are absolutely for women having sex and will have sex with these women, there's still this wiring that I've heard a lot of them struggle with like, finding out how many partners a girlfriend has and being turned off by it, simultaneously knowing that that's their programming that they don't subscribe to anymore, but feeling helpless to change that aversion.
Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead, Armin.
I remember that shame very vividly because the way we were brought up is we were told that God could see our mind, like see what we're thinking. And the problem with the God that I was taught to believe is that he's not just a tyrant of your actions, he's also a tyrant of your thoughts, right? So you could be sinning not because of you doing something, not because you're looking at a woman, not because you're talking to a woman, not because you're watching porn or anything like that. You could just be having ugly like thoughts. And like, so going through my teenage years, I remember every single time something like that crossed my mind, I feel so disgusted. I feel like God is watching me. I thought like so ungrateful, so low, and I kept praying and begging for forgiveness and saying so unworthy of having so much blessings from God. And instead of being thankful, instead of showing appreciation, I'm failing to do the most basic things that are asked of me. And how disgusting and vile do I have to be to even have such thoughts like this? Like, how could I be so pathetically weak to fail so miserably? I could remember and constantly begging God and promising that this would not happen again, and it constantly happened again. So I remember that a lot. I know what you're referring to. But Ali, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think that a lot of this also, especially in Middle Eastern culture, what I saw, it's still pervasive, and I think it's actually pervasive all over the world. It's just the idea of thinking of women as property. Your daughters, you don't want them to be subject to other men. You're going to cover your wife because you don't want other men to look at her. And I sort of disagree. I think with Armin in that I do think that the paternity aspect, like knowing that your kids are yours, because you had heirs, you had people had you had emperors and you had kings and everything, and they wanted to make sure that they passed it on to their. We've all seen Game of Thrones, right? And that's rooted in some element of historical reality. So
Ali, your mic is constantly touching your
yeah, sorry, I forgot to hold it up. So I think that this idea of property, even the word husband, right? About animal husbandry, what they do is like they manage cattle and goats, and the dowry system, paying for a woman, and the younger she is, the more virginal she is, the higher the dowry is. So there's all these, like, just historically, a lot of this really points to, women being the property of men, which is, just a hallmark of patriarchal societies. And, that's why you have a double standard when it comes to your daughters versus your sons, when it comes to the sexual aspect of it, and the sexual purity too. But yeah, so I think that's one point that Lois brought up, and some of the other people brought up that has some merit. But I wanted to get, unless you wanted to say something about that.
Well, it's interesting, and this is sort of unrelated, but also very much related. I read somewhere, and I cannot for the life of me remember if it was in Christopher Ryan's Sex at Dawn, all about how humans are not hardwired for monogamy. There's no evidence for that, actually. I can't remember if it was there or if it was in a fictional series called Clan of the Cave Bear. I was reading both around the same time, but so forgive my lack of being able to accurately source this, but I remember coming across the theory that, like I was saying earlier, a lot of prehistorical belief systems did seem very female deity-centered. And there's a theory that changed when men realized that one man could father a child. And you didn't need multiple men to sleep with the same woman to ensure that she would reproduce. You only needed one man to do that. And when men could realize that their power of the contribution to creating life, they became more possessive of it. I don't know if I'm phrasing this accurately, but I do think that theory, wherever I came across it stuck with me, in the sense that kind of makes sense, especially if resources were scarce and you needed to provide for a limited amount of kids. Maybe it kind of makes sense that you'd want to make sure they're yours. I could empathize with that perspective. But I think Christopher Ryan mentions in Sex at Dawn that women in some places, they used to be encouraged to sleep with multiple men within the same tribe, because the idea was that the child would get different aspects from all the different men. Some might get this man's sense of humor, this man's hunting skills. And when we realize that, you just need the one, maybe that's when proprietorship took hold and patriarchy therefore took hold. I think that's a very interesting theory that I'm grateful some people are exploring, and I love to read the occasional book or article about it because it's fascinating.
I think Sex at Dawn was a great book, because I remember he talked about a lot of these sort of evocyte concepts where it was actually the females that were promiscuous, because they would, even we call it female copulatory vocalizations, like the noises that they make, that was a signal to other males in the area to come, and they would let all of the males duke it out to get the best genes. It was like an evolutionary thing there too. And so I thought that was really interesting, that it wasn't just, they say, well, this monogamy is unnatural for males. A lot of people think it's just for men, but historically it was actually, and we're finding out more and more, right, as there's more sexual empowerment among women, that it's not just promiscuity is not just a man thing, right? It's both. A lot of this is socialization. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. Armin.
I do think it makes a lot of strategic sense. I mean, not morally, but strategically, for the sex that has more physical power, and at a time, especially where physical power means more control, to allow as many partners for itself as it wants, but also make the other sex treat the other sex like a commodity, where it could collect as many of it, as much as it has control, as much as power it has, to be able to collect as many of it as possible, and to also remove the access of other competing, male individuals to have access to her, by suggesting that she is only his and no one else's. This is my product, my commodity, and nobody gets to own it but me, which makes me wonder if things would be exactly the same, but from the other side, if women had more physically they were stronger, I would argue that they would probably do the exact same thing to men if they were stronger, but I don't know.
It's definitely interesting to think about. I've definitely thought like, I wonder if what would history and therefore today look like if both sexes were more just physically equal? Because we're just not. For the most part, we're just not. And that's just the cold, hard physical truth. And just from a strictly biological standpoint, like there's like what is equal when we're talking about biology? But I'm very grateful for at least intellectual equality to be I'm a very grateful participant in the intellectual equality that I, as a privileged American woman, get to experience. And I'm very deeply sympathetic to those who still don't have that yet.
Hey guys, if you want to join these streams live, get your comments and questions read by Ali and Armin and the guests, and most importantly, to get full access to the full video versions of all these episodes, become a patron. Link in the description below.